So as October went into November and into December, it grew cold, and I didn't realize how cold it got in Hanoi in the winter. But prior to Christmas, they came in and told me there was a delegation that were having a world conference in Hanoi, and it was of the world's people in unification against a U.S. imperialism and neo-colonialism and something against all the poor peoples of the world. You know, these titles go on and on. Well, it turns out that one of the delegations had asked if they could see me. And so the officer, interrogator, came and asked if I would like to meet with this delegation from Cuba. And so I said, well, sure, why not? I wasn't doing anything, and, break the monotony. So I went to see, they took me to see, to Hanoi, quote, unquote, because every time we went, from then on, went somewhere, you drove round and round for an hour, and then, because they had told me I wasn't in Hanoi, but I knew I was in Hanoi. So this delegation was of this individual and his wife from Cuba. His name was Robert Williams. I remember that name. He was a big black African American who had gone to Cuba from the United States and used to broadcast English-speaking propaganda, I guess, from Cuba. So and when he came down, I sat at a table, a chair like this that I'm sitting in now, and there was a coffee table with lots of fruit, cookies, things. And I started gobbling the cookies. I started sticking them in my pocket whenever I could, whenever he turned around or something. So he finally said, if I ask Ho Chi Minh if he would release you, you could come home with me. You could go home. He said, would you like me to do this? Would you like me to ask him? I said, sure. Yeah, sure. Go ahead. He said, but wait a minute. He said, you have to do something for yourself. You have to help yourself, too. And I said, like what? He says, well, you could write a letter saying you're going, how well you've been treated and all this stuff. And obviously they had coached him what to say or what they wanted out of me. And I said, I can't do that. I'm not going to do that, which was at a point there. That was my first Christmas. And at the conclusion of that meeting, they took me back to my cell. And the next day, here comes the officer and said, you do not want to go home with Mr. Williams. You can still have a chance. And I said, all right. I said, I'll tell you what, I'll write a letter to him. And I wrote something to the effect that, dear Ho Chi Minh, it was to whom it may concern. I think I've been a good, I forget exactly how I wrote it. A model prisoner, and I think I should be released to my country. Signed, Lieutenant J.G. Everett Alvarez. Next day, the officer came back in, and you said, you have been very insulting. You said he said, you say to whom may concern, not to President Ho Chi Minh. You are not a prisoner, you are a criminal, and you signed your name with the title. Your title means nothing here, nothing, Lieutenant J.G., U.S. Navy. He says, he says this, and I said, well, that's all I'm going to do. And so that passed. The first Christmas there was a very lonely Christmas. They brought me a special meal. They brought me a quantity of food. The food had remained good after my interrogation, but the quantities were still meager. And then early February, there was news, and they used to bring me material to read of the English translation of the Voice of Vietnam broadcast, where they broadcast propaganda to the troops or whomever. And it talked about another raid, and this time they had shot down and captured a pilot, Robert Shoemaker. So I remember thinking, well, I'm not alone. And then they came rushing into my cell, but just prior to that, I was watching, and so I could have on the door that led to my room. I was in a room that had, it was a good-sized room, and it had access to a little courtyard in the back that had a vat. And above the vat, that's where I used to wash myself. And then on the corner was an outhouse with little footstools. You put your feet on that, and you squatted on the hole. That was a commode. And that was my world, actually, that little courtyard. I can see the blue skies when I would go get out there a little bit during the day and walk back and forth. And then on the front door, they had a little crack on it, and they had a little peephole from the outside. You could move it, and I could learn how to move it, peek out. And I could always see them when they came, when they would bring my food, and then one day they started bringing two stacks of plates, one for me, and then they would take the other one in that direction, which means Shoemaker was back over here in this area. And then I would watch, and then they would bring 3 trays, and then 4 trays, and they would disperse certain areas of the Hanoi Hilton. And then one day they came, and this was about the end of March, and they had all these knee cards with weapon settings and all this stuff. And they said, help us, you can help us understand what all this is. And at that point I said, the war's on. There's just no way I could collaborate. And I said, things maybe get tough with me, and I don't know what they're going to do with me, but I kept thinking. That one fellow said one time, we're not going to kill you. And on the other hand, I don't know what they would do if I said no, but I said, no, I'm not. So they were, quote, disappointed, unquote, and that's when they moved me from that big room to a smaller cell. At a little area, a place that we used to call Little Vegas, where they used to, it backed up to an area where they kept the women prisoners. And it was an area that still had all Vietnamese prisoners in the 7-foot by 7-foot cells with 2 concrete beds. And it was, and I was locked up in one of those for 24 hours, except for 10 minutes when they would let me out to dump out my waste bucket and to sort of wash my clothes and then back in the cell. And it was the following summer that I made contact. One day I'm sitting in my little cell, and I had gone through a period, I think, of depression, mainly because I just sort of, trying to block out that noise and what was happening around me, and I would learn to stuff my ears with little pieces of rag so I don't hear the screams from the people getting beaten up. And I learned to, I learned to compartmentalize and not think about home, not think about the family, not think about my wife, because all I did was just, it would frustrate me, and there was nothing I could do about it. So I learned to sort of just put that out of my mind and concentrate on other things, and I would daydream, fantasize, what have you, and I slept a lot. But one day it just struck me that I was not helping myself. So I started a routine of starting to do push-ups, sit-ups, running in place, and see how I could pick it up. I could barely do 2 push-ups. I was still I lost a lot of weight. I think I was down to about 110 pounds. So I realized that, I had to do something, and then I started developing my routines that I used to have initially, but I sort of just I wouldn't say I lost hope. I just didn't know what was going to happen, and I didn't realize that I was not helping myself. So gradually I began to feel better, even though the meals were small. And the fact is that there were other Americans there that were, it was comforting, even though I had no contact with them. And then one day I'm looking at the bottom of my metal bowl, and I flipped it over, and somebody had scratched on the bottom with burnt matchstick, was it? Or, yeah, it was something that said, "Hi," had a bunch of names, about 4 or 5 names. So I took a matchstick that I had, because they had given us cigarettes. They gave me cigarettes, and I would pretend I was smoking. I'm not a smoker, but anyway, and so I had the burnt matchstick, and I put my name on there, and that's how the others knew I was in the area. And so they came back with a message. I looked, and several days later I found this, hi EA, the score is Navy 7, Air Force 7. And I thought, why would they want me to know the score of Navy Air Force football, I guess? But actually what they were telling me is there were 7 Navy and 7 Air Force guys there. And then I found another note, on a plate that said, alone near to God, and it said G. So I didn't know who that was. So that message must have gotten to somebody else. And then there was another message that said, "Is there a WAP in Hanoi?" And I figured, okay, I'm with a bunch of Americans now. I know what. So it turns out that one day I'm out at the courtyard, and I wash my clothes, and the guard hadn't come yet. And I look up, and the sky's blue, and I'm in good spirits, and and so I started singing, "Oh, what a beautiful morning." And you're not supposed to do that, but I felt like doing that. And from over the wall, I heard this, "Oh my God." They must have let him out the same time they let me out. And I said, "Who is it?" And I couldn't make out who it was because it sounded like Geronimo. I'm thinking, good God, the paratroopers must have landed or something. But it turned out to be, it was Larry Guarino. So, the WAP in Hanoi, so they were looking for him. And here he was over the wall on the other side of the courtyard. And so I knew he was just you had to go through 2 different doors, gated iron doors, to get to his courtyard. So in the meantime, that first Christmas, I had received the Red Cross package from the International Red Cross. I'm the only one that I'm aware that ever got that. And it had a couple little wash towels and a few items and chocolate, what have you. And all I had left by that time were the washcloths. And when I got out, I would, wash myself and then hang them up. And I had 2 I would alternate. So when the guard went to lock me up, I had one wash towel, and I said, showed him the wash towel over there. And he's looking at me, and he goes, "You over there?" I said, "Yeah." So he took the washcloth. And that is when the Vietnamese officers, the camp commander, knew that I knew that there were other Americans there. So that night, they came in, they told me to wrap it up. It was September 13th, 1965. September 18th, excuse me, 1965, and they came in, told me to wrap up my gear, which I did. And you always, threw you in your blanket, your mosquito net, in your straw mat, rolled it up, and with your water jug, and and they led me out blindfolded and handcuffed. You always go handcuffed whenever you left the prison. And they put me in the back of a Jeep truck. And there was one fellow in there, and it was Larry Garino, G, and he was blindfolded and all that. So they told us, keep silent. So I said, "Alvarez." He goes, "Garino." I said, "Okay, that's Garino. Alvarez." "Oh, God." He goes, "Oh, God, where have you been?" I said, "I've been right here." And then they bring another fellow on. It was Phil Butler. And the other, another fellow who was Hayden Lockhart. Hayden Lockhart was the third guy shot down after Bob Shoemaker in late February, early March of '65. And then so they took us out to a camp that we called the Briar Patch. It was out in the country, no electricity, no running water, had wells, very primitive, but that's where the first 15 pilots were located. And they put me in a cell with Larry Garino and told me to keep quiet. And the guy who took us out there was quiet was a guy, interrogator that we called the Rabbit. And I got lots of stories about the Rabbit just prior to. He was a nasty guy. Anyway, so I was telling Larry, and Larry's stumbling around and says, "Where's the light switch? Where's the light switch?" And we're talking, and I said, "See that guy there? I hate him. I hate that guy." In front of the Rabbit who's standing in the doorway saying, "Keep silent, keep silent." So we were ignoring him and talking away. And, so next thing they pulled me out, put me in a cell right next to Larry. Next morning we woke up and here's all this whispering back and forth from the various windows and the cells, and there turns out that there's several buildings, and the next building over the wall, we started, Larry could talk over the wall to that other building. There was Shoemaker, Lockhart, Butler, Harris, Smitty Harris. There were about four guys. Some of the other fellow was there, and in the cell next to me on the other side, Larry was on one side, and he was by himself. I was in this room by myself, and then around the corner were Scotty Morgan and Ron Stores, and I don't think there was anybody else in that particular building, but it turns out that was like being in Coney Island. As far as I was concerned, and that was there that I learned the tap code, and which became very critical for us. It was our lifeline. In later years, it was most important. And then from there, after a few weeks, they moved us back to Hanoi to a place that they had converted into a prison. They were converting it while they moved us in. They were building the cells, which we called it the zoo. One of the fellows that was the Air Force F-1 RF. He was a reconnaissance RF 101 pilot named Bob Purcell. He named it the zoo. I said, why do you call it the zoo? He says, because that's where the animals come to look at the people. And what happened was local people would come in and open it up, and they would show the kids, a prisoner. You could open the shutters, and they were, they had bars in the windows, and they could look in. And they showed the population. They called us the criminals, war criminals. But that's what we call that place, the zoo, and it had the various buildings. They all had the names. We were very good, I think, at naming buildings and stuff like that. Very appropriate for the conditions and what was happening at the time. And that one turned out to be one of the bigger camps later on because they kept adding and adding. It was in November, the beginning of November 1965, and I was in a cell, still in a cell by myself, and the door opened up, and here comes another American pilot. He still had flesh on him. His name was Tom Barrett. He was a backseater of an Air Force RF, F-Force Charlie, F-4C. He was a little bit younger than me. He was my first cellmate. That we stuck together. We stuck together for quite a while. And then the following spring, they moved us back out to the Briar Patch, and it was while we were at the Briar Patch, 1966, that things started to get rough. They started the torture sessions, starting with the senior officers. And initially it was to get by, to force us to talk and to write. I was one of the first that they got to us when they started that process at the Briar Patch that spring. And here they were, wanted me to write down my biography and all that, and of course they knew all about me. But I knew that was one way to get you to talk, and by the way, the rest of the guys had not gone through that experience, and there was a lot they didn't know, so they started, call it torture, call it whatever. Things gradually got harsher and harsher, and then when they got to what they wanted for propaganda, they would really apply the torture when they really wanted something out of you. The first time they came after me for propaganda, I resisted. I knew what it was, and they wanted me to do and he went for days and days, and without sleep, without adequate rations, and they start cutting back on the water, and then I wrote something, I forget what it was. The second time they came after me, a few months later, it was right after the Hanoi March, where they took 52 of the American prisoners, and they marched us down the streets of Hanoi. We were still at the Briar Patch, but they took us and brought us in trucks, and then they put us together with prisoners from other camps. So there were a total of 52. We were blindfolded on the trucks, handcuffed. But then when they took us off the trucks later, and I was still blindfolded, Tom Barrett and I had been handcuffed to each other. But then they took him and led him somewhere and brought another fellow on, and it was Robbie Reisner, General Robbie Reisner, later general, one of our senior officers. And Robbie and I marched arm in arm, handcuffed together for the parade. That we were the third in line. The first one was a fellow named Al Bruno, and Schutte was the last name. Then Butler and Lockhart, myself, Robbie, and the others. That was a scary experience, I have to admit. We didn't think we were going to make it. But miraculously, we all made it with the help of the Vietnamese guards that kept the crowd away from us. They really whipped that crowd up, and it was right after that we got back out to the briar patch that they started the torture routines for propaganda statements, criminal statements. First time they put me through that was rough, and others were being the rope was we were continually in ropes, but tied up. But then when they wanted those things, they used these big manacles that cut off the blood circulation and gave a lot of pain. And after about a day of that, I broke and gave them a botched up statement of some sort. The bottom line is that just like everybody else, once you did that, personally, I felt, and I'm sure the others felt, that I had betrayed my fellow POWs. I had broken the bond, not giving in to them, knowing it was propaganda. It was a statement basically saying that I was a criminal and I had killed women and children or whatever. And I just felt so bad. I had let people down in my mind, and when I got back my cell, they had done the same thing to Barrett. And you just couldn't face each other, but through the tap code, the others were experiencing the same things. They would take him out first one and then another one and go through the same. We all broke. And those of us that were in this area, we gave them propaganda. And even though we tried to botch it up as bad as we could, knowing full well that they were going to come back again and again. So out of that, the senior officers, that's where I have to credit people like Stockdale, Reisner, the others. It's, hey guys, give it all you got, and knowing, but don't go beyond the point where you have to, where you can't bounce back, because you're going to have to face it again and again until they get tired of you, or until something happens. So that's what we did, and and through tapping on the wall, we kept each other's spirits up. Every one of us broke. I had one cell was J.P. McCamey and Paul Carey. McCamey's now deceased. There was Jim Bell. He's now deceased. He was a senior officer in that area, and at the time, and they pump you up and keep you going. That was our job, to keep each other going and keep each other's morale and humor each other. And it was hard. It was hard because of the conditions that, they were pretty primitive out there. And then the Vietnamese had us dig foxholes under our bed because of the raids in the area. So that every time there was a raid, we'd have to crawl underneath the foxholes. Lots of stories I tell when I'm in front of medical students or what have you, health professionals, talk about the food. I mean, we were lucky to get the food. We didn't have all kinds of parasites, all kinds of stuff. You had when they would let your food out there, you'd have to wait till the guard opened the door and let you out. And by that time, especially at the briar patch, you could hear. They used to have like cows or other animals out there in the area that would come along, and you could hear slurping, eating your food or your soup if we had pumpkin soup. When it was dark, they would feed you in the morning. When it was just turned light, then they would feed you at night, usually after dark in the winter months. And no electricity, so you brought the food into your cell and ate it. And the standing joke was, if you felt a crunch, you knew it was a cockroach. And if you felt a big crunch, you knew it was a big cockroach. And the joke was, at least you're getting some nutrition in there. The question, was it a male or a female? You know. And then with the air raids, we had to jump underneath and get into our hole behind the bunk and sit there and finish our meals like we're at a counter, with the plate up here and we're in the hole. And the rice, there would be rice and pumpkin soup. That was about it. Pumpkins, it was just a broth, really. Oh gosh, lots of interesting days, nights. It got so cold, we jumped, it was nothing to jump in bed together and used our blankets to share, and then we put one mosquito net over us to cover both ourselves, while the other mosquito net was in place to keep the mosquitoes out. Mosquitoes were rather bothersome. And that's one of the things that the Vietnamese did if they were being punished, sticking you in a room without sleep or what have you, or else they would put you in a cell and they'd take your mosquito net away. So you get try to keep the mosquitoes off you is always a challenge. That's how time passed. Time passed slowly. We kept track of time somehow. Always keeping our spirits up. We would try to keep our sense of humor up. When we get together now and we think about those old days, we talked about the times we laughed and scratched. We don't talk about the tough times. We don't talk about the torture. We don't talk about the things that made us feel bad or cry. But we talked about things that made us laugh, dumb things. Things like keeping the Bell Bureau barometer. There were two guys, Jim Bell and Art Bureau. Jim Bell was a Navy lieutenant commander, like I mentioned his name before, and Art Bureau was an Air Force captain. Jim Bell must have been the world's greatest optimist, and Art Bureau must have been the world's greatest pessimist. And they lived together in a cell. Couldn't you imagine how that might have been? And so the question was, they had a barometer. So if something happened that it would make you feel good, they would raise the barometer up a notch. Or if something happened that made it was a downer, they would drop it. So we called it the Bell Bureau barometer. And double going through the wall. How's the barometer today? And if somebody found a little piece of meat in their soup by accident or something like that, they pass it through the wall. We found a little piece of meat. Oh, that's a good sign. The barometer would go up. And then the next day, if somebody came along a plane and they bombed nearby and AAA and all this stuff, barometer would go down. Things that itself kept us. It was like entertainment. Optimism was always there. We always knew what day it was. Don't ask me exactly how, but we always knew what day it was. And our sayings were, our motto, our themes were like, if it was New Year's, we'd say, home by Easter. And as we got close to Easter, no, home by the 4th of July. And then as we got into the summer, close that, home by Thanksgiving, and then home by Christmas. And as we get close to Christmas and New Year, in '67, it was We'll be in heaven in 67, and then New Year's of 68. Things will be great in the old 48. It rhymes with 68. Everything's fine, 69, we'll be fine, and on it went. So time went by, and the torture sessions continued, and you learn how to bounce back. It got to be sort of ridiculous that the Vietnamese knew what we were doing, and they sort of played this game, this stupid game. We lost guys. They didn't come back. They just couldn't bounce back from some of those sessions. We didn't lose an awful lot. It wasn't like the guys that were captured in the South, where there was disease and sickness that was the biggest toll. Somehow we didn't get sick. We had, I think we found ways to get by. Kept ourselves as clean as possible. But we had the usual, diarrhea, dysentery. Depending on what you had, the docs, the camp the nurse would give you. They had a camp a nurse. She had the dirtiest white smock. I mean, it was just filthy. And they dispensed these pills. So if you had little brown ones, if you had diarrhea, they give you little brown pills. If you had little white pills, were like quinine for fever and stuff. And then combination of both. Don't ask me. One time, because of I came down with hepatitis. I mean, it was just miserable hepatitis. Out of the goodness, quote, the goodness they had given our camp vaccinations, but they used a long syringe, and they used the same syringe on everybody. And a bunch of us came down with hepatitis. And in my case, the remedy was a plate of white granulated sugar, white sugar. And by that time, they were giving us some bread, so we put a little water in the sugar and with the bread. And that was the medicine. Things like that. There were other things that we had that, we had a lot of stuff. Parasites. Used to have parasites. We used to deliver. I say deliver. They used to pass them. I could always tell when I was going into delivery because I'd get stomach cramps. And then pop out beautiful worms about yay big. And it's like giving birth. In fact, some of my speeches, I talk to the health professionals about delivery. They think it's funny. I make it comical. But then take these things and take it outside and compare with others. When they get out, the chance to get out, they would look at the contest who had passed the biggest parasite. Dumb things like that. Holidays, we learned how to make little objects out of bread, sticky rice bread. And we'd make little knickknacks. Some of them are displayed in the museum. We brought them back, like little cigarette holders, little ditty bags for your toothbrush, toothpaste, little tube of toothpaste you'd get. Then you could hang it up on your mosquito nets. Mosquito nets were invaluable because not only were they great for mosquitoes, they were important for other things. You learned to tuck it underneath your straw mat, and so that rodents wouldn't come into the sack with you. Not only rats, but sometimes, depending on your location, snakes. It's an eerie feeling to wake up and there's a rat under your blanket with you. These things were that big, it really scares the hell out of you. And it used to happen. It didn't happen to me, but when it happened to one of my fellows sleeping next to me, he woke up screaming and tossing. It scared the heck out of me too. And that's how time passed until we started hearing news about. And we got the news. You know, they would broadcast on the camp radio. They broadcast the news. Of course, you learn to filter that out. Like in '68, they were always condemning the U.S. aggressors, and condemning that. And then one day they were talking about the oppressive United States government who treats its citizens, the American people, are treated so badly, you know, that minorities, blacks that can't afford shoes, and on they go. And the proper diet and all that, a country as great and as rich as the United States, a country that can put a man on the moon, cannot afford to give its people shoes and clothing and all that. And tap on the wall. Did you hear that? Tapping on the wall. We put a man on the moon. So that's how we learned to filter, and we gathered news, and then shoot downs would give us news too. '68, the shoot downs basically stopped because of the Paris peace talks. For almost 4 years they stopped. There was little news from outside. Once in a while, we started getting letters from home, 6-line, like a postcard. There were a lot of the fellows that families didn't know that they were alive. But, you know, mine, you know, I started getting the little postcards. And so that was something to look at. You would write, say for Christmas, you'd write a letter, and then you would get a response like in the middle of summer. So you get twice a year, maybe you get to write again. And that went on for a couple of years during the Paris peace talks. And we heard about the Paris peace talks a lot. But by we heard about Nixon elected in 1968, so '69. We heard about big campaigns in the South, and every time they would broadcast how the United States troops were basically, heavy losses, obliterated, hundreds of aircraft, helicopters shot down, etc. We knew there must be a big battle somewhere. We heard about the Tet Offensive, and victory was, you know, they were singing these victorious songs and what have you. We heard about the division at home, the peace protests. At one point, they took us out to show us homemade movies of the protests at home, the protests at Berkeley, and the riots in Watts, Detroit, and American people rising up and so forth. And then they take us into into interrogation. What do you think of the American people? Well, they're unemployed students with, they don't shave when they're dirty. So, you know, how could you act? How could you talk like that? So we punished for our answers, and back into leg irons and solitary and what have you. Still have a bad attitude, Alvarez. Still have a bad attitude. Now, we were always told that until we developed a good attitude, we'd never go home. Then one day, '72, spring, the bombing started again. And this time it didn't stop. And it slowed in a little bit before the '72 elections, but once, you know, and of course we heard all about McGovern and how he was going to, the country loved him, but Nixon won. And when the results came in and the bombing started up again, and Linebacker 2, I guess it was called, and the B-52 started coming in night after night after night. And you could see simultaneously as the tempo increased, the morale of the people of the Vietnamese started to wane. It started to go down, and it was just, I mean, at the end, they just didn't even want to go man their anti-aircraft, which is all around the Hanoi Hilton there. They would moan and groan every time the sirens went off. Oh no, and they were just tired. They'd had it. Makes you wonder why we didn't do it years earlier, but yeah. It was a most morale-wise, and by the way, we were still getting increased amount of food out. We were living in bigger groups starting from late 1969, 1970, especially after the Sante raid, and they put us all into one camp, the Hanoi Hilton, and then they started spreading us out again after they took half the guys and put them in a camp near, right on the China border way up north. They figured they were safe there. In other words, they were safe from rescue attempts. And the rest of us stayed in the Hanoi Hilton. Bigger groups, quantity of food increased, exercise increased. So by the time of linebacker 2, I mean, we were pretty healthy. I was pretty healthy. And, you know, a lot of exercise, lots of food, and we had mail from home starting to come in, things that they've kept for years. One of the big pastimes was playing bridge. We got cards, things to entertain ourselves. We got pretty good at bridge, and a fellow, Jerry Coffey and myself, we always partnered up. We would win bridge tournaments. Then one day the bombing stopped right after Christmas, '72, and we knew that this was it, because there was no way that Nixon was going to quit without having things resolved. You know? And so a few days after that, they started rearranging us, and we're in a cell with, I found myself in a big cell at the Hanoi Hilton there, Camp Unity, which was a section with a big big yard in between, all these big cells around it, 40-man cells. And here I was in a cell with the first 40 guys shot down. So they were arranging it. Then they took us out one day and read the terms of the Paris Peace Accords, and that we would be going home. And that night they brought in the guys from the camp near the border, near the China border. And as they walked in the middle of the night, we hear this noise. I jump up and looked out there through the bars, and I see guys. And I hadn't seen guys in years. And gosh, there's Metzger, and there's Rice, and there's Tom Barrett. And by that time, I'd received the news that the year before, the Christmas before, that my wife had remarried and was no longer there. I hadn't seen Barrett since 1960, 69, and here it was, 73. And so he's, I said, Tom, is that you? And he goes, yeah. The guys are washing themselves with a big vat, just coming in with all their personal items, their straw mats and what have you. And I said, how's everything? He says, well, his girlfriend, Marcia, didn't wait. And I said, my wife didn't wait either. And he goes, yeah, I heard. That was the first thing we said to each other. A few days later, they started issuing out clothing. And a couple of nights later, they said, okay, the first group will be leaving in the morning. And so we did, the morning of February 12, 1973, Lincoln's birthday. Lincoln freed the slaves, right? So Vietnamese freed us. And we marched out of that prison. There's some humorous parts to this story, but in essence, they marched us out. The gates opened up. We marched out. We got onto the buses, headed for the airport. For the first time, in all those years, we walked out without being blindfolded and without being handcuffed. And I remember very, very distinctly how we stopped at one point. And I was always cynical, because I was always, after having gone through so many emotional ups and downs and cessation in the bombings and talks and going here and the Paris peace talks, years later where they're still talking, and I learned to say, I'll believe it when I see it. So here we are on the bus heading to the airport. And in a way, I said to myself, I'll believe it when I see, when I'm on the airplane. Then the buses stopped, and we went into like a warehouse. It was a stop along the way. Well, they gave us a sandwich, and we heard the news that there was a glitch in the talks, and we had to wait. And I figured, oh God, here we go. We're going to get back on the bus and go back to the prison. But we didn't. We got back on the bus, and we headed to the airport and got off. And I could see on the ramp was a big C-141, and then a bunch of C-130s. I think about two or three of them on the ramp out there. And then as we walked around the corner, we lined up in twos, and myself and Bob Shoemaker, the second one. And once to round the corner, here it was set up. There was a table, and there was a rope on this side, a rope on this side, and a rope on the other side. On the other side of that table, there was an American, and there was a Vietnamese officer, and the Vietnamese officer was the rabbit of all people. And they had a list of names, so he walked up, and they were talking amongst themselves, and on the other side was an American Air Force officer. I remember his name at the time. I can't recall it now, but I remember that name for years. And he looked at us, and he sort of walked over and said, "Wait, so it's okay, wait." So somebody took a picture of us through telephone lens, and it was myself and Bob, and then the others behind us. And I think that's the one that I use on the cover of my book. And then they called our names, and then we stepped forward, and there was an escort right there to walk us to the airplane, down the ramp. So the adrenaline is building up this year as we're getting to the airplane, and people tell this story many times in different ways, but you get to the back of the C-141, and the ramp is down, and you look up, and up at the top of the ramp are two Air Force nurses, flight nurses, and I tell you, they were gorgeous. For those of us who hadn't laid eyes on American women for a long time, so long, and we walked in, and the rest of the guys loaded up. I sat next to Bob Shoemaker. We sat together, and they gave us a soft drink. I hadn't had a soft drink in so many years. It tasted really good. And the plane closed up, and there were State Department people aboard. Dr. Roger Shields from the State Department was there. He was one of the senior American government officials, and he was probably the most senior one there. I later heard that Henry Kissinger was in Hanoi, but not around us. And the engine started up and people start cheering. And cynical old me, I'm thinking, we're liable to have engine trouble and have to stop again, right? And thank God it didn't. So we're taxiing down, and then it started rolling down the runway, and that's where there's a photo of our group taken about the cheering, and as it lifted off. And we got airborne, and I'm sitting there, and Bob's sitting here. We're both quiet, and we sort of just tapped our soft drinks and said, "Well, we made it, Bob, made it." And the rest is history.